Hey everyone, it's Mary at Calumet Knits, and I have a new tutorial for you today. This is how to make a gingham scarf using your 22 needle circular knitting machine. This pattern comes in 6 different sizes and uses the 22 needle machine. Let's get started. How to cast on is not new, but the position at which you cast on is important for alignment. Start by casting on with waist yarn and knitting about 4 or 5 rows. Change to your main color, and we're going to change color at the number 1 needle position, and then we're going to knit the number of rows per the chart. Instead of changing color at the number 1 needle like we normally would, we're actually going to go 1 needle over and make our color change on the number 2 needle. Insert your new color and hold on to your tails and crank a little bit. We're going to go almost all the way around. I want this color change stitch almost to pop up. I'm going to use my loom hook and insert it in between the 2 little tabs and pull back on the stitch and crank at the same time. This is going to keep that previous row stitch on the machine so that we can knit those 2 stitches together. And then you can go ahead and continue with the number of rows that you need. Let me show you how I create the knot in the tails. You can see this stitch here is fairly loose and this stitch over here is loose. All I want to do is pull on the tails just enough to tighten those 2 stitches up a little bit. And then I can go ahead and tie my knot. Now I'm not pulling the stitch next to it over. I'm only removing the slack from those 2 stitches. So let me show you the color change again, and then I'll show you a different angle. So remember, we're changing color on the number 2 needle. Hold your tails just a little bit and crank almost all the way around. I'm waiting for that number 2 needle to pop up. I'll insert my loom hook and pull that stitch back. Crank the machine a little and that needle's pop up so it's not going to fall off. And I'm holding my tails just to make sure that loose stitch stays on. Now here's a different view of what we're doing. Here's the stitch that I want to keep on, number 2. Just slightly pull back on that stitch a little bit with your loom hook and then crank and you'll see the needle pop up. That keeps it on the machine. And then on this side I wanted to show you that there are 2 stitches here. We have our color change stitch on the top and the previous row stitch on the bottom. And we're going to knit those 2 together, so we need to make sure that both of those loops stay towards the bottom. Continue to knit per the chart, making all your color changes at the number 2 needle. Binding off is not a new technique, however we need to make sure we do it in the proper position. For this pattern, we will bind off at the number 1 needle position. This will allow our column of stitches from the cast on edge to the bind off edge to be the same, which is critical for seaming. Now another thing that's a little different when I bind off my waist yarn is I actually use my tapestry needle and thread the waist yarn through so that I don't drop any stitches while I am working with the tubes. Now this is optional. This is just something I do to avoid drop stitches while I'm working with the tubes. Okay, So we have our knitted tube here, and this is my cast on edge with the purple, and I'm going to mark it with some stitch markers so that when we go to seam we align our tubes correctly. So I'm going to put 3 on here, so this indicates that which direction the cast on edge is pointed. And then on the bind off edge we need to mark the side seam. And so the hole that's created when you change from your main yarn to your waste yarn, that is going to give us our side seam column. So we're just going to follow that down a little ways and place a stitch marker. And then I will fold the tube right on that seam, and the column of stitches is the V is pointed towards the cast on edge. So that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to place my tube vertically with the bind off edge on the bottom and the cast on edge at the top, and I'm going to fold them into the center. Be careful not to twist your tube. Okay, the tails will be coming off the top side on the cast on edge and off the bottom side for the bind off edge. So when we start grafting, we're going to graft between the 2 tails and then go all the way around and end up back at the tails again. So before we get started on grafting our tubes, I want to show you on these 2 small samples the stitches that we'll be doing. Now if you haven't done grafting before, I would suggest starting off with some sample pieces with waste yarn and following the same instructions, just to have some practice. Now we'll be joining the tube I'm using this green yarn here so you can see the stitches. And we're going to go from the bottom to the top all the way across both tubes here. Now I'm going to start with creating what I call a setup stitch. And to do that, I'm going to go up from behind the stitch and pull that through. So all of the directions are going to be from the front side of the fabric. So I'm going up from behind on the top row, just like we did on the bottom, and I'll pull that through. So the stitches that I do on the bottom, I'm also going to do on the top side. Now we're going to start our normal repeat. So I'm going to go down through that previous stitch. So down from the front side of the fabric to the back side, and I'll pull that stitch through. And then I'm going to come up from the back side and pull that stitch through. So when I say down, I'm referring to the front side of the fabric. I'm going to go down through the front side and then up from the back side. So on the top, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go down through the previous stitch, and then I'll come up through the back of the stitch of the next stitch. Okay, and we're going to alternate between the top and the bottom. And this time we're going to combine the 2 steps together. So I'm going to go down through the first part, or down through the previous stitch, and I'll come up through the next stitch, all in one movement. And then pull the yarn through. And now we'll do the same on the top. I'm going to go down through the previous stitch, turn my needle, and come up through the back of the next stitch. So we'll continue alternating between the top and the bottom, going down through the previous stitch and up through the next stitch. And you can see I'm adjusting my tension here a little bit. We'd like to try and match the same stitches in the rest of the tube there so it becomes seamless. So I'm going to go down through that previous stitch and up through the next stitch. So you can see I've got 2 stitches already formed, and they are lined up with the rest of the stitches on both tubes. And if I was using the same colored yarn, it would be almost seamless. So what I do on the bottom, I need to do on the top. So we go down through the previous stitch and up through the next stitch. And we just created the right leg of the next column of stitches. Now we'll do the left leg by doing the same movement, going down through the previous stitch, up through the next, and then repeating that on the top side. And there's our left leg. So that is the movements that we are doing when we're grafting, and hopefully this gives you a better visual on what we're doing when we have waste yarn on our tubes. So with that, let's get started on grafting our tubes together for our project. So to start, the first thing we need to do is mark our stitches. We want to mark the first and last stitch on both sides of the tube. So this stitch here is our first stitch, which is to the left of the tail, and our last stitch is actually that tail stitch. And then on the top, our first stitch is to the left of the tail, and our last stitch is just to the right of the tail. Okay, now we're ready to start grafting. I'll go ahead and put my long tail on my needle and we'll get started. So our setup stitch is going to be done on the first stitch on both sides. And to do this setup stitch, what we're going to do is come up through that stitch and pull our yarn through. And then on the other side, we'll do the same thing. We'll go up through that stitch and pull the yarn through. Now we'll pull our tail together, or we'll pull the tail so that the top and bottom are pretty close together. We want it about the stitch length as the rest of the knitting. So now we'll go down through that previous stitch, or our first stitch, and then we'll come up through the next stitch. So this is the start of our repeat. So we'll go down through the previous stitch and up through the next stitch. So now we'll switch to the top and do the same thing. So we'll go down through the previous stitch, and we'll go up through the next stitch. So we're going to do these 2 stitches together in one movement. It will go a lot faster and we'll have less tangles in our tail here. So we'll go down through the previous stitch, up through the next stitch, all in one motion, and then pull it through. And then we'll repeat on the top side, down through the previous stitch, and up through the next stitch. So that's our repeat. On one side, we'll go down and up, and then we switch to the top side and go down and up. And now as we pull their tails through, you want to try and make sure you're keeping the same tension as the rest of the knitting. So we'll continue to alternate the top and the bottom all the way around until we get to the last stitch marker, and I'll meet you there. So we're almost done. I have one more stitch to do on the top and the bottom before we can take the waist yarn off. So here we are. I'm going to go down through the previous stitch and I'm going to come up through the last stitch. And then we'll do the top side. We'll go down through the previous stitch and up through the last stitch. So this area is getting kind of tight. It's harder to see the stitches. That's why I like to use the stitch markers. So now we can go ahead and remove the waist yarn carefully. We don't want to stretch any of these grafting stitches. Alright, our waist yarn is removed and we are left with our 4 stitch markers and 2 tails. So we're going to finish off these last couple of stitches and close up this hole. So with my tail, you can see it's coming off the top. So now I need to move to the bottom and I will go down through this stitch, which is our previous stitch, and I'll remove that stitch marker. Now normally we would go over to the next stitch, which happens to be our stitch that's on the stitch marker, our first stitch. But since we're knitting in the round, I'm going to go up a row and I'm going to pick up the stitch that we created in our first stitch of grafting, which is right here. So I'm going to go up through that stitch. And we can remove that stitch marker. So now we'll do the same on the top row. So I'll go down through my previous stitch. And again, instead of going through the next stitch, I'm going to go up a row and go through that stitch. And pull that through. So now we can remove that last stitch marker, and we have one more thing to do, which is to move that tail over to the other tail so that we can tie a knot and bury the tails. So I'm going to do that by creating kind of a duplicate stitch over one leg of the row below, or the one stitch below where I'm at. This is the stitch right here, this gray leg. So I want the white to go behind it just because I think it'll look better when we're dealing with these two colors. So I'll insert my hook underneath and come out where the other tail is. And I'll pull it kind of tight. And then I'll pull the other tail to kind of cover up that new leg that we just made. In the end, you won't notice this. So now we can go ahead and knot these tails and bury them. So we have our 3 tubes completed. They are all grafted together. I've got them kind of laid out how we're going to seam them together. I've got my cast on edges mostly lined up. Here, I'll fix that. Okay, now that's lined up, and then this one is lined up. So, and I also have my edge stitch markers. That's the column of stitches that we're going to use to graft or to seam these tubes together. So I'll put one aside. So I have my yarn. It's about twice as long as my tubes. And I'm going to start right at this intersection here. That's the join, our grafting row. So the first thing we want to do is verify our column of stitches is one column from start to finish on our tubes. So to do that, I'm just going to follow that column all the way around until I get back to the very beginning. And that column of stitches should not jump. It should be all one column. So you'll want to verify this column on all of your tubes that you're going to join. So I've already done the bottom tube there, and we'll go ahead and start to seam these together. So again, I'm lining up my cast on edges with the stitch markers there. And in that column that we identified, I'm going to go to where the two colors meet, and I want to find the 2 black bars. It's kind of hard to see in this dark. Okay, so here are my last 2 black bars. I should have 1 stitch that's gray and 1 stitch that is black. Both of the bars will be black. This is our starting point on this bottom tube. So once we have that, we can go ahead and pull that tail through, and you'll want to leave about an 8-inch tail. And then we'll go over to the other tube and do the same thing. We're going to find that column of stitches and find where our matching squares are. And this time I want 1 white bar and 1 gray bar, and both of those stitches are white. So with this setup, all of the joins should match up perfectly. So now we'll go back to the first tube and insert our needle into the same hole that we just came out of, and we'll pick up 2 more bars. And then the same on the other tube. Go into the previous stitch, pick up 2 bars, and pull it through. So all we're doing now is just alternating between the top and the bottom, picking up 2 bars at a time. So we'll continue to alternate between the bottom tube and the top tube, going through the previous stitch and picking up 2 bars and pulling through, and then going to the other tube, going through the previous stitch, picking up 2 bars and pulling through. So we'll do this until we get through the first intersection or different where our color changes, and then we'll pull our working yarn to remove the slack that we're creating here, and it'll close these seams together. And I like to do this after each colored square so that I know my joins are lined up perfectly. Okay, so here it is before we pull on the tails. And we'll just give a little tug and it zippers together really nicely. And you can see our points are matched up on the front and also on the back side. So now I'll just continue to seam all the way around until I get back to almost the beginning. I'll stop about 1 inch away. So here we are, I'm almost done. I have a small hole here that I still need to do, but I want to show you how to stretch this seam so that it stretches when you're trying to put it on. So I'm going to hold my finger towards that starting spot and I'm going to pull down, and what I'm doing is just pulling the fabric over that seam, that seaming yarn there, and I'm just stretching it out, and so you'll keep doing this until you can't find or can't feel any resistance in that seam. Once you're happy with it, then you can go ahead and finish closing up this hole. And when you reach the beginning, what I do is move both tails to the inside of the scarf, and I will make the knot there and then bury the tails. So the first seam is done. Now let's work on the second seam. We're basically going to do it the exact same way. We're going to find that column of stitches, and we'll start by finding the last 2 gray bars when we insert our needle. And this time we're going to find 1 white stitch and 1 gray stitch, and both of those stitches will have gray bars. So once we find those 2 gray bars, we can go ahead, pull our tail through, or pull our yarn through, leave it again about an 8-inch tail, and then go over to the other tube, find our column of stitches and our matching square, and we want 1 gray bar and 1 black bar. And both of those stitches will be gray. So when we find that, we'll go ahead and pull our tail through. And the rest of the seaming is the same. So we'll go through the previous stitch, pick up 2 bars, and then move to the other tube, go through the previous stitch and pick up 2 bars. And again, I do the same thing where once I cross the intersection, I'll go ahead and remove the slack to verify those intersections are perfect, and then I move on. And then the rest of it's the same. Stop about an inch from the beginning and stretch your seam, and then go back and finish the seam, move the tails to the back, knot your tails, and then hide the tails. And now we are finished with all of the seaming, and the last thing to do is remove any remaining stitch markers. I hope you enjoyed the video on how to make your own gingham scarf. Below are the links to Etsy and Ravelry for the pattern. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel for more circular knitting machine tutorials. Thanks for watching.